In the dry season of 1972, in a small village on the edge of the Sahel, known as Kolangani, while every farmer within a day's walk was busy with the sensible work of survival, patching thatch roofs, driving cattle toward the last green pastures, and praying over cracked fields for a rain that refused to come, an 11-year-old boy named Idrissa Coulibaly was doing something else entirely. He was not herding. He was not fetching water. Day after day, under a sun that turned the earth the color of old bone, he dug small, shallow holes into the ground in a wide, uneven ring around his family's mud brick hut. With a broken hoe blade lashed to a wooden handle and a woven basket balanced on his hip, he paced out the spacing with strange care, measuring each hole roughly 2 arm spans from the next, then adjusting the distance near the northern wall, where the wind carried the most dust. Nothing about it looked random, though nothing about it looked useful either. Inside the hut were his mother, Fanta, thin with worry after 2 failed harvests, and his 6-year-old sister, Aisha, who liked to drop pebbles into the empty holes when her brother wasn't watching. Neighbors passing the compound on their way to the well would slow their steps just to stare. Some laughed under their breath. Others shook their heads and murmured that the Coulibaly boy had finally lost his senses, digging into ground that hadn't held a proper rain in over a year. They could see Idrissa wasn't planting anything yet. The holes sat empty, dark mouths in the pale, cracked soil, and that was the part no one could understand. To them, it didn't look like farming. It looked like a boy quietly wasting the last of his family's strength on a foolish game. And if he was wrong, the coming dry season would not forgive that mistake. What did those small, empty pits actually hold? Would Idrissa's strange ritual save his family from the hunger closing in around Kolangani? Or would it be the thing that finally broke them? Subscribe to find out how this quiet standoff between a boy and an entire village came to its end. One late afternoon, an old man leaning on a walking stick made from a dead acacia branch stopped at the low mud wall bordering the Coulibaly compound. This was Boubacar Traoré, the village headman, a man who had buried 2 wives, outlived 3 droughts, and never once in 60 years been wrong about the land in front of the whole village. His face had gone leathery under the sun, not from age alone, but from decades of watching crops rise and fail beneath a sky that gave nothing freely. He stood at the wall for a long moment without speaking, studying the ring of small holes circling the hut. Then his expression shifted, not amusement, something closer to alarm. Boubacar stepped through the gap in the wall and walked slowly toward the nearest hole, his sandals stirring pale dust with every step. Fanta watched from the doorway, one hand pressed flat against her chest. "You know what the dry wind does to open ground, boy?" Boubacar finally asked. Idrissa kept digging. Boubacar looked toward the horizon as if seeing another dry season entirely. In the year the well at Sanu ran dry, I watched 3 families dig pits just like these, thinking they'd catch whatever rain came. No rain came. The wind found the bare earth instead, pulled every last drop of moisture out through those holes, and by harvest, their fields were dust from wall to wall. He gestured at the ring surrounding the hut. "Open ground doesn't hold water here. It loses it faster." Then his eyes moved to Fanta. "You're letting your son dig graves for whatever seed you have left." Salimata, Boubacar's wife, had stood quietly at the wall through most of the exchange, but before turning to follow her husband home, she looked toward Fanta with an expression that carried more sorrow than judgment. Her gaze drifted across the uneven pits, then toward the thin sacks of millet stacked just inside the hut's doorway. "Dreams don't fill a stomach," she said softly. "Careful hands and a full granary do." Fanta said nothing. The old couple walked back through the gap in the wall and down the dry path, dust rising behind them in the fading orange light. Boubacar never looked back. Salimata did once. Idrissa returned to measuring the space for the next hole, the dull scrape of the hoe blade against hard earth, the only sound left in the compound. Steady, unhurried, almost stubborn. but the quiet around the hut felt different now as evening settled over Kolangani. Fanta stood in the doorway, wrapped in a faded cloth, watching her son work beneath a sky bruising into purple. Aisha had already fallen asleep on the mat inside. For a long while, only the wind spoke, dragging thin curtains of dust across the compound wall. Then Fanta finally asked the question that had been building inside her all afternoon. "Idrissa, are you certain about this?" The host stopped. Not for long. Just long enough for her to understand that her son knew exactly how much he was risking with every hole he cut into the dying ground. That night, after Aisha had curled up beside the cold hearth, Idrissa sat near the doorway, sharpening a short digging stick with an old knife, the fire's last coals casting a weak orange glow across the packed dirt floor. Fanta sat across from him, mending a torn cloth by feel more than sight. "I'm not trying to trap the rain," Idrissa finally said. Fanta looked up. "I'm trying to catch what little of it we get before the ground steals it back." He explained, haltingly at first, that the earth around Kolangani had grown so hard and bare that when rain did fall, it no longer sank in. It ran across the surface in thin brown sheets, carrying away topsoil, seed, and whatever hope had been planted, pooling uselessly somewhere beyond the fields, before vanishing into the heat. "The ground isn't thirsty," he said quietly. "It's forgotten how to drink." For the first time, Fanta began to understand that the holes were not graves, and were not decoration either. They were something closer to a mouth, waiting. 2 years earlier, when Idrissa was still small enough to be carried on his grandmother Miriam's back during the long walk to the millet fields, he had watched her stop beside an old termite mound, rising taller than a grown man near the edge of the family's land. While most children ran past such mounds without a glance, Miriam had knelt beside it after a rare rain and pressed her palm flat against the reddish earth at its base. The soil there stayed cool and dark long after the surrounding ground had baked pale and cracked again. She told him, in the unhurried way old women on the frontier of the Sahel told their most important lessons, that termites never wasted water. Their tunnels ran deep beneath the mound, channeling every drop downward instead of letting the sun steal it back into the sky. "The insects understand the ground better than we do," she had said, brushing dust from her knees. "They don't fight the dry season. They just teach the water where to hide." That memory had stayed folded somewhere quiet in Idrissa's mind for 2 years. Through Miriam's death the following harvest, through the first failed rains, through the slow, tightening hunger that crept over Kolangani like a shadow, lengthening at dusk. It surfaced again only when he sat one evening watching runoff from a rare storm carve thin, useless rivers across the family's bare compound, carrying away in minutes what the sky had taken all season to give. Over the following days, the strange ring around the Coulibaly hut slowly began to reveal a shape. The outer holes, wider and shallower, sat roughly 3 armspans from the walls, spaced to catch the broad sheets of runoff before they could gather speed across the open ground. Idrissa called them the catching mouths. Closer to the hut, a second, tighter ring of smaller, deeper pits waited beneath a thin covering of dried grass and goat manure he had begun collecting from the edge of the herding paths. These he dug barely an arm's length apart in places, packing each one with whatever decaying plant matter and dung he could gather, then covering it loosely with a thin crust of dry soil. Aisha followed him from hole to hole some mornings, carrying handfuls of dried grass in her small fists, while Idrissa checked the depth of each pit again and again with a notched stick. Some of the spacing looked uneven, almost careless, but nothing about it was accidental. Small gaps between certain holes pointed deliberately away from the hut's low doorway, so that if the pits ever overflowed, the water would spill sideways into the surrounding scrub, rather than pooling against the mud walls and softening the foundation. Fanta watched much of it from the doorway without interrupting, and slowly the work stopped looking like a child's game to her. It looked deliberate. It looked, in its strange, quiet way, like a system. The labor itself became a punishment measured in blistered palms. Nearly every morning before the worst heat rose off the flats, Idrissa walked almost an hour toward a dry riverbed, where old flood debris and rotted branches still lay tangled along the banks, dragging back what he could carry in a woven sack slung across his shoulders. The path grew familiar beneath his bare feet, packed hard by his own returning footsteps, long before the first proper test of his design ever arrived. And then, on a morning heavy with the smell of distant rain that never seemed to reach Kolangani's dry fields, something happened that made even Idrissa stop and stare into the nearest pit in silence, uncertain for the first time whether the whole idea had been a mistake after all. What Idrissa saw that morning was not what he expected. Overnight, a rare freak rain had swept in from the east, the kind of sudden, violent cloudburst that sometimes struck the Sahel, even in the dry months, arriving without warning and vanishing just as fast. It had not been a gentle rain. It had come hard and fast, hammering the compound for perhaps 20 minutes before rolling on toward the hills. Idrissa had slept through most of it, and when he stepped outside at first light, his stomach dropped. The outer ring of catching mouths, still unfinished on the western side where he hadn't yet dug past the goat pen, had done nothing to slow the water. It had rushed straight across the bare, unprotected gap, gathering speed exactly the way Boubacar had warned it would, and struck the base of the hut's western wall with enough force to carve a shallow gouge into the mud brick. A dark, damp stain crept up the foundation nearly to knee height. Fanta came out moments later, saw the stain, and said nothing, but her silence was louder than any accusation. Idrissa knelt beside the gouge and pressed his palm against the wet clay, feeling how soft it had already become. For the first time since he'd begun digging, doubt settled into his chest like a stone. The design hadn't failed because the idea was wrong. It had failed because it was incomplete, and an incomplete ring was worse than no ring at all. It gave the water a clear channel to run through, rather than a wall to break against. Word of the damaged wall spread through Kolangani before the mud had even dried. By midday, a small cluster of neighbors had gathered along the low compound wall, murmuring among themselves. Boubacar arrived last, leaning on his acacia stick, and studied the gouge in silence for a long moment. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. "The ground remembers what it wants to do," he finally said, more to the gathered onlookers than to Idrissa directly. "Water finds the gap. It always finds the gap." Some of the younger men nodded along, satisfied that the matter was settled. A boy from a neighboring compound, a restless troublemaker named Yassine who had lost 2 goats to disease that season and seemed to enjoy any misfortune that wasn't his own, laughed loudly enough for the whole gathering to hear. "Maybe the wall will fall down before the rains even come properly," he said, "and save us all the trouble of waiting." A few people chuckled. Fanta's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, and the crowd slowly drifted back toward their own compounds, satisfied they had witnessed the beginning of the end. That evening, Idrissa sat staring at the gouge in the wall for a long time, before he finally understood what had gone wrong. The outer ring needed to be continuous. A single gap was enough to undo everything, because water, like a man's worst instincts, always searched for the easiest path rather than the hardest one. He would need to close every gap in the western ring before the next rain came, no matter how small it seemed, and he would need to dig the pits in a staggered pattern rather than a straight line, so that even if water breached one row, it would strike the next at an angle instead of running through in a straight, gathering line. Fanta watched him sketch the new pattern into the dirt floor with a stick that night, tracing rows that overlapped like the scales of a fish. "You're not just fixing the wall," she said quietly. "You're redesigning the whole thing." Idrissa nodded without looking up. "The rain already showed me my mistake," he said. "I'd rather learn from a small storm than a big one." The following days brought a different kind of trouble, one that had nothing to do with wind or water. Idrissa woke one morning to find nearly a third of the western pits filled back in, the loose soil packed down hard as though someone had worked through the night with deliberate care. At first he assumed wandering cattle had trampled the ground, But cattle left, scattered, uneven damage, hoofprints, torn grass. This was neat, methodical. Someone had done it on purpose. Fanta found footprints near the compound wall the next morning. Small ones, a boy's stride, leading back toward the Traoré side of the village. Neither of them said Yassine's name aloud, but neither needed to. Some in Kolangani had begun to whisper that the ring of holes was drawing bad luck to the village, that digging so many mouths into the earth invited spirits that should have stayed buried, and a few families had grown genuinely afraid rather than merely amused. Fear, Idrissa was learning, could turn neighbors into saboteurs far more easily than mockery ever could. He said nothing to anyone. Instead, he began waking before the first light each morning to check the ring, before anyone else in the village stirred, redigging what had been filled in, tamping the loose soil back into shape, working in silence while the compound still slept. Some mornings the damage was small, a single pit disturbed, a few handfuls of dirt kicked carelessly across another. Other mornings it was worse. Twice more that month he found sections deliberately collapsed, and once he found a dead bird placed carefully at the bottom of one of the deeper pits, wings spread as if to send a message no one needed to explain aloud. Fanta wanted to go to Boubacar and demand the sabotage stop, but Idrissa shook his head. "If we complain, it becomes a bigger story than the holes themselves," he said. "Let them think the wind did it." He rebuilt every section without comment, and slowly whoever had been filling the pits in seemed to lose interest, perhaps unsettled by a boy who refused to react to anything at all. By the time the true dry season deepened toward its cruelest weeks, the trouble at the Coulibaly compound became a smaller concern next to the trouble spreading across all of Kolangani. The village well, already low for 2 seasons, dropped further still, forcing women to walk nearly 2 hours each morning to a smaller spring near the hills, one that was itself beginning to show a muddy, uncertain bottom. Millet stalks in the surrounding fields, planted in hope rather than confidence, withered into pale, brittle husks before they'd grown knee-high. Cattle grew thin and restless. 2 families quietly began preparing to leave Kolangani altogether, loading what they could carry toward relatives in a town nearer the river, a decision no one on the frontier of the Sahel made lightly. The mood in the village shifted from mockery to something closer to desperation, and in that shift, the strange ring of holes around Idrissa's hut stopped being a joke people told at the well, and became instead a subject people avoided discussing at all, uncertain now whether laughing at it still felt appropriate, when everyone's fields looked equally doomed. Fanta's own resolve began to waver during those weeks. One evening, watching Aicha eat a thinner portion of millet porridge than usual without complaint, the way hungry children learn not to complain. She turned to her son with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not doubt exactly, something heavier. "Idrissa," she said carefully, "if the rains come and your holes don't hold, we won't have time to plant again this season. There won't be a second chance." Idrissa understood what she was really asking, whether it was time to stop, to fill the ring back in, to plant the ordinary way in the ordinary places like every other family in Kolangani, and accept whatever the season gave them, good or bad, the way his father's father had, and his father before that. He sat with the question for a long moment before answering. "Grandmother used to say the termites never fought the dry season," he said finally. "They just built somewhere the dry season couldn't reach." He looked toward the darkening ring of pits outside, barely visible now in the fading light. "I'm not asking the rain to be kinder than it wants to be. I'm just trying to build somewhere. It can't take everything away." Fanta didn't answer, but she didn't ask him to stop either, and that silence, more than any words, told him she had decided to trust him a while longer, even as the sky above Kolangani stayed a hard, merciless blue for another 11 days without a single cloud crossing it. Then on the 12th day the wind shifted. It came first as a change in smell, a heaviness in the air that every farmer on the frontier of the Sahel had learned to recognize since childhood. The particular scent of moisture gathering somewhere far off, Still hours or days away, but undeniably real. Boubacar stepped outside his own compound that evening, lifted his face toward the darkening horizon, and stood very still for a long time. Clouds were building over the hills to the east, thick and low, the kind that didn't simply threaten rain but promised it, the way only the rarest storms of the wet season could. Word spread through Kolangani within the hour, and for the first time in months, the village held its breath together over something other than hunger. Somewhere beyond the compound walls, in fields that had waited 2 failed seasons for exactly this moment, farmers began readying whatever seed they had left, and around the Coulibaly hut, in the staggered rings Idrissa had rebuilt night after night through sabotage and doubt, and his own mother's wavering faith, the empty pits sat waiting in the gathering dark, uncertain themselves, it seemed, whether they would prove to be salvation, or simply the largest mistake Kolangani had ever watched a child make. The storm reached Kolangani 2 nights later, and it did not arrive gently. It came the way the oldest men in the village said the rains used to come before the dry years began, as a wall of black cloud rolling low over the hills, lit from within by flashes that turned the whole sky the color of hammered iron. Wind came first, dry and hot, then suddenly cold, carrying grit and the sharp smell of ozone across the compound. Fanta pulled Aicha inside and barred the thin wooden door while Idrissa stood a moment longer in the doorway, watching the first fat drops strike the packed earth and vanish instantly into dust that hadn't tasted water in weeks. Then the sky simply opened. Rain fell in a way none of them had seen in over a year, not a soft mist, but a hard, driving curtain of water that turned the compound's bare ground into streaming sheets within minutes. Inside the hut, the 3 of them sat close to the hearth, listening. There was nothing else to do. Idrissa had done everything he could weeks and months earlier, every pit dug, every gap closed, every staggered row checked and rechecked by lantern light. Now the design either held or it didn't, and no amount of worry from inside the hut could change what was happening outside in the dark. Aicha pressed against her mother's side each time thunder cracked close enough to rattle the thin roof poles. Fanta kept her eyes on the door, as if she could see through it to the western wall and its old, healed scar. Idrissa said nothing at all. He simply listened to the sound of the rain, trying to guess from its rhythm alone whether it was still falling in sheets across bare ground somewhere, or whether, out there in the dark, something was finally catching it. Toward the middle of the night, during a brief lull between 2 waves of the storm, Idrissa could bear the waiting no longer. He wrapped a cloth over his shoulders, took the small oil lamp from its hook, and pushed the door open against the wind. Fanta called after him, but he was already outside, boots sinking into softened earth, the lamp throwing a weak, trembling circle of light ahead of him. What he found in that circle of light stopped him where he stood. The outer ring of catching mouths, the ones he had redesigned in the days after the freak rain, were not overflowing the way the old, unfinished ring had. They were full, brimming close to the rim, but the water inside sat calm and dark, not rushing anywhere, simply held. Beyond them, the ground that should have carried runoff in fast, cutting sheets toward the hut walls instead, showed only slow, shallow pooling, most of it already sinking downward rather than racing forward. He moved closer to the inner ring, the smaller pits packed with rotted branches and dung, and knelt despite the rain still falling around him. The soil there had gone dark and soft, but it hadn't collapsed. It had swollen almost, drinking the water down instead of shedding it. He pressed his palm flat against the earth, the way his grandmother once had beside the termite mound, and felt the same thing she must have felt all those years ago. Coolness, depth, water moving somewhere beneath the surface instead of somewhere above it, already lost. The storm returned in full force before he could examine much more, and Idrissa hurried back inside, soaked through, saying nothing to Fanta except that the walls were dry. She studied his face for a long moment in the lamplight, searching for whatever he wasn't telling her, but let it rest. The rain continued through most of the night, easing only slightly before dawn, then returning in a second, shorter burst just after sunrise, as though the sky itself wanted to be certain its work was finished properly. By the time it finally broke, gray light spreading thin and pale across a transformed landscape, Kolangani looked like a different village entirely. Paths had become shallow rivers. Low ground near the well had turned to standing pools, thick with churned red mud. And in more than a few compounds across the village, the storm had not been kind. It rarely was, on the frontier of the Sahel, even when it finally came. Boubacar walked the paths of Kolangani that morning, the way he did after every serious storm, checking on each family in turn, expecting the usual accounting of damage that followed hard rain onto ground, too dry and too bare to receive it gently. He found exactly what he expected at most compounds. A collapsed section of wall here, a flooded storage pit there, thin topsoil stripped away and ugly brown scars across fields that had barely begun to green. 2 families had lost the last of their seed stock to water pooling where it shouldn't have. It was the kind of mourning that confirmed everything Boubacar had believed his entire life about the unforgiving nature of the land he'd spent 60 years learning to read. Then he reached the Coulibaly compound and stopped at the low wall exactly where he had stood weeks earlier to deliver his warning about graves and wasted seed. The western wall, the one that had carried the ugly dark scar from the earlier freak rain, stood clean and dry, the old gouge barely visible beneath a faint new crust of settled mud. Around the hut, the ring of pits sat full but calm, water resting in each one like small dark mirrors reflecting the pale morning sky. Nowhere did he see the churned, stripped ground he'd seen everywhere else that morning. Nowhere did he see the fast brown scarring that came from water, racing unchecked across bare earth. The compound looked, impossibly, untouched by the very storm that had reshaped half the village overnight. He stepped through the gap in the wall and walked slowly from pit to pit, saying nothing, his walking stick sinking slightly into softened but intact ground with every step. Idrissa stood near the doorway, exhausted from a sleepless night, and said nothing either. There was nothing left to argue. Boubacar knelt with some difficulty beside one of the inner pits and pressed 2 fingers into the dark, saturated soil packed with rotted branches and old manure. He held them there a long moment, then withdrew his hand and studied the moisture clinging to his skin, as if it might explain something words could not. The rain still fell everywhere the same, he finally said, mostly to himself. It didn't choose to be gentler here. He looked up at Idrissa. You didn't stop the storm from coming. Idrissa shook his head slowly. I never tried to, he said. I just gave it somewhere to go that wasn't through our wall. Boubacar was quiet for a long time after that, turning the words over, the way a man turns over a stone he suspected for years might be worth more than it looks. When he finally rose, brushing damp earth from his knees, there was no pride in his voice, only something closer to reckoning. 60 years, he said, and I never once thought to ask the ground where it wanted the water to go. I only ever told it where I wanted the water to stay away from. He looked once more at the calm, brimming pit circling the small mud hut, then back at the boy who had built them. That was my mistake, not yours. The weeks that followed brought the first real green Kolangani had seen in over 2 years. Around the Coulibaly compound, the effect went further than anyone, even Idrissa, had fully expected. Wild grass sprang up thick and fast along the inner ring, feeding on moisture that lingered in the soil long after the surrounding fields had dried back to their usual pale crust. When Fanta finally pressed millet seed into the ground near the pits that season, following rows Idrissa marked out with the same careful, staggered spacing he'd used for the holes themselves, the stalks that rose weeks later stood noticeably taller and greener than anything else planted across the village that year, drawing on water still held deep in the soil long after the rains themselves had passed. Neighbors who had once crossed to the far side of the path, rather than walk near the strange ring of holes, now found reasons to pass directly by the Coulibaly wall, slowing their steps just as they had months earlier, though for entirely different reasons. Boubacar returned first, this time carrying no warnings, only a length of knotted cord for measuring. "How far apart did you set the outer ones?" he asked, and that was how it began. Before long, other families across Kolangani started digging their own rings, some closely copying Idrissa's staggered pattern, others adapting it to the shape of their own compounds and fields. Yassine's family, quietly and without ceremony, dug a ring of their own before the following wet season, though no one in the village ever mentioned the dead bird or the filled-in pits again, and Idrissa never brought it up either. Elder Musa, watching a cluster of children measure spacing near the well one afternoon with sticks and knotted string, gave a low grunt of amusement and said that soon there wouldn't be a compound left in Kolangani without its own ring of catching mouths circling the walls. The name that stuck in the end wasn't nearly as grand as anyone expected. People simply began calling them the Boys' Wells, though they held no water fit for drinking, only water fit for remembering what the ground could do if given the chance. Years passed, and the rings around Kolangani did not remain a curiosity for long. Season after season, families refined the spacing, adjusted the depth, learned through their own small failures the same lessons Idrissa had learned through a freak rain and a scarred western wall. The village never stopped fearing the dry years. The Sahel offered no such mercy to anyone, not even to those who had learned to read its ground more carefully. But when the worst droughts returned, as they always eventually did, Kolangani lost less than the villages around it. Wells held a little longer. Millet stood a little greener. Families left for the river towns a little less often. Aisha grew into a young woman who taught her own children to press their palms against damp earth, the way her brother once taught her, feeling for coolness, for depth, for water choosing to stay rather than being forced to disappear. Fanta lived long enough to watch the strange ring of holes her son once dug in defiance of an entire village become simply the way things were done, unremarkable, permanent, quietly woven into the shape of Kolangani itself. Idrissa Coulibaly never spoke of that first freak rain, or the sabotaged pits, or the long nights spent rebuilding what jealousy and fear had torn apart, as anything more than the price of learning something worth knowing. He had never claimed to control the drought, only to understand it a little better than the men who had lived beside it far longer than he had. And in the end, the same dry season that had once threatened to bury his family's last hope in empty, mocked holes, became instead the thing that taught an entire village how to hold on to water it had spent generations simply watching disappear. Do you think Idrissa was truly wise beyond his years? Or was he simply one of the few people in Kolangani willing to listen to what the dry ground had been trying to say all along? Every great change begins with someone willing to think differently and care for the world around them. Idrissa showed us that true wisdom isn't always found in strength or experience, but in the courage to observe, learn, and persevere, even when no one believes in you. If this story inspired you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, what lesson will you carry with you from this story?